Welcome back. Picture a morning in the year 1450, somewhere along a limestone ridge in the west of England. Mist is still sitting low in the valleys. A shepherd is already awake, moving slowly across a hillside pasture, counting sheep whose fleece is, quite literally, worth more than gold by weight in some of the trading houses of Europe. Church bells are ringing in a town whose spire looks far too grand for its size, paid for entirely by wool merchants who have never left England but whose goods are being worn by nobles in Florence and Bruges. Nobody standing in that field yet knows that this quiet patchwork of hills will become one of the most photographed, most romanticized, and most quietly resilient landscapes in the world, nor that the very thing making them rich today will one day nearly vanish from these hills entirely. Using AI reconstructions, historic paintings, and the surviving stone itself, we're going to walk through those centuries together, scene by scene, and by the end, you'll also see exactly how these same lanes, churches, and market towns look right now in the present day. Long before wool made this region famous, the Cotswolds were something far more modest. The name itself likely comes from Old English words meaning sheep enclosure in rolling hillsides, a description of geography rather than glory. Iron Age communities had already settled these uplands centuries earlier, drawn by natural springs, defensible high ground, and grazing land that the local limestone bedrock made unusually fertile for sheep in particular. When the Romans arrived in the 1st century, they recognized the same advantages, laying a major road, the Fosse Way, straight through the heart of the region and building substantial villas near what is now Cirencester, then known as Corinium, which grew into the 2nd largest town in all of Roman Britain. Mosaic floors, bathhouses, and grain stores from this period still lie beneath modern gardens and farmland. After Rome withdrew, the area folded back into smaller Saxon settlements, farming communities with no particular importance beyond their own survival. The people plowing those fields had no way of knowing that the pale, unassuming stone beneath their feet, and the sheep grazing above it, would one day make this one of the wealthiest rural regions in the country. By the height of the medieval wool boom, roughly the 1300s through the 1500s, the transformation was extraordinary. Cotswold sheep, a breed prized for exceptionally long, lustrous fleece, produced wool so valuable that English monarchs taxed it directly to fund wars. Merchants poured their profits into what became known as wool churches, soaring parish buildings far larger and more ornate than their small congregations required, built almost as public advertisements of success. The church at Chipping Campden rises with a tower over 120 feet high in a town of a few thousand people. Northleach's church contains brass memorial plaques set directly into the floor, engraved with wool sacks and sheep, quite literally marking merchants' graves with the animals that made them rich. Market towns like Stow on the Wold hosted fairs where, according to surviving records, as many as 20,000 sheep changed hands in a single day. Construction was constant and never quite finished. Church towers were added to over generations, guild halls were expanded as trade grew, and disputes over grazing rights and wool prices simmered continually beneath the surface of apparent prosperity. This was not a static postcard landscape. It was a working, argumentative, ever-changing economic engine built entirely from stone and sheep. At the civic and spiritual heart of Cotswold life sat the wool churches themselves, alongside market halls and guild structures that governed trade. The Church of England structured religious life, but older customs lingered in harvest festivals and well blessings that predated Christianity by centuries, layered quietly beneath Sunday services. Wool guilds effectively regulated much of daily commerce, setting standards for fleece quality and settling disputes between merchants, shepherds, and weavers. The market cross, still standing in towns like Stow on the Wold, marked the literal center of civic life, the place where deals were sealed, punishments were sometimes carried out, and news was announced to the assembled public. Grand medieval buildings and much older Saxon foundations often sat within the same few hundred yards of one another, a visible timeline that any resident would have walked past without a second thought. Ordinary daily life moved to a rhythm dictated almost entirely by the wool calendar. Shearing season brought crowds of workers into the towns, and market days transformed sleepy high streets into crowded, noisy, and occasionally chaotic spaces filled with the smell of livestock, with smoke, and freshly baked bread. Wealthy wool merchants lived in stone townhouses close to the church, while laborers, weavers, and shepherds occupied smaller cottages further from the center, a class divide visible simply by walking down any given street. Population estimates for a mid-sized wool town in this period rarely exceeded 2,000 or 3,000 people, small by modern standards but bustling and self-contained by the standards of the age. Graffiti carved into church stonework by bored apprentices and initials scratched into market beams give a glimpse of individual personalities lost to history, ordinary people leaving small, stubborn marks of their own existence. One landmark tied directly to public gathering and civic pride was the market hall, and nowhere is this more visible than in Chipping Campden's market hall, built in 1627 by a wealthy wool merchant specifically as a covered space for trading dairy and produce. Supported by open stone arches, the hall could shelter dozens of stall holders at once during poor weather, and it quickly became the unofficial heart of town identity, a literal shelter for commerce that doubled as a symbol of civic pride. Records suggest disputes were occasionally settled beneath its arches, and it remained in continuous use for market trade for centuries, a rare structure that never stopped serving its original purpose. At the other end of the social spectrum stood the great houses of the wool aristocracy and, later, the landed gentry. Sudeley Castle, near Winchcombe, is one of the most striking examples, a residence with royal connections dating back centuries, complete with elaborate gardens, banqueting halls, and a chapel where Catherine Parr, the last wife of Henry VIII, is buried. Wealthy owners filled such estates with imported tapestries, painted ceilings, and formal gardens designed purely for leisure and display, a stark contrast to the practical stone cottages a short walk away. Yet whatever grandeur these estates achieved, the coming centuries would prove that neither castle walls nor careful stonework could shield anyone, however wealthy, from the economic storm gathering on the horizon. That storm arrived gradually, then all at once. Beginning in the 16th century and accelerating through the 17th and 18th, England's wool trade began shifting away from the Cotswolds. Enclosure Acts consolidated common grazing land into private hands, disrupting small farmers. Competition from northern England's faster, water-powered mills and later steam-driven factories during the Industrial Revolution undercut the slower, traditional Cotswold methods almost entirely within a few generations. Many historians estimate that by the early 1800s, the wool income that once built soaring church towers had declined by a significant majority, leaving towns that had grown wealthy on sheep suddenly without their central economic purpose. There was no single dramatic collapse, no fire or invasion. Instead, it was a slow, quiet draining away of relevance, as merchants moved elsewhere and younger generations left for industrial cities in search of work. What followed was decades, in some cases well over a century, of economic stillness. Grand wool churches remained standing but grew quiet, their congregations shrinking. Market halls saw less trade. Many towns essentially froze in place architecturally, simply because there was no money available to rebuild or modernize, an accidental preservation born entirely from poverty rather than intention. Locals in the later 19th century sometimes described the region as forgotten, a beautiful but economically stagnant backwater increasingly out of step with an industrializing nation. The rediscovery, when it came, arrived not through archaeology but through artists and idealists. In the later 1800s, the arts and crafts movement, championed by figures like William Morris, who lived at Kelmscott Manor near the edge of the region, began actively celebrating exactly the qualities that industrial decline had preserved: handcrafted stonework, traditional building methods, and a slower, pre-industrial way of life. Morris and his contemporaries wrote admiringly of the honey-colored limestone cottages and unspoiled villages, drawing artists, writers, and eventually tourists to a region that had spent a century believing itself left behind. What archaeologists and historians later found remarkable was how much original medieval and Tudor fabric had survived untouched beneath later centuries of neglect, preserved almost by accident, offering an unusually intact window into pre-industrial English life. It's worth pausing here, briefly, to remember that every church tower, every market cross, every cottage doorway we've walked through tonight was once someone's entire world. These were not stage sets. They were homes where children were born, workshops where livelihoods were built stitch by stitch and fleece by fleece, and public squares where entire communities gathered to celebrate, argue, and mourn together. The stones remain. The people who shaped them are gone, but their fingerprints, quite literally, are still pressed into the mortar. Today, walking into Chipping Campden, you'll find that soaring church tower still standing. Its merchant memorials still legible on the floor for anyone willing to look down rather than up. The market hall remains open to visitors, its stone arches unchanged since 1627, now sheltering tourists rather than dairy stalls, maintained by the National Trust. Northleach's church still holds its brass woolsack memorials, polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. Stow on the Wold's Market Cross still marks the center of a town that hosts antique fairs rather than sheep auctions, though the square itself has barely changed shape in 5 centuries. Sudeley Castle remains privately owned but opens seasonally to the public, its gardens restored to their historic layout and Catherine Parr's tomb still resting quietly within the chapel grounds. Kelmscott Manor, William Morris's country home, is preserved as a museum, displaying his original textile designs in the very rooms where he lived and worked. And the wider landscape itself, those rolling limestone hills and dry stone walls built without mortar, remains protected today as one of England's designated areas of outstanding natural beauty, ensuring the same view that first drew wool merchants and later weary artists continues largely unchanged for anyone willing to walk it. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight, wandering through wool fortunes, quiet decline, and unlikely rediscovery. If you enjoyed walking these hills with me, let me know in the comments and tell me where you'd like to travel next, because there are still so many forgotten corners of history waiting to be found.